Computing.
Good morning and welcome to True Talk. This is your host Samar Jarrah. My co-host Ahmed and I are pleased to be on WMNF and at the studio. And also we are transmitting live via Twitter, my Twitter account, Samar, S-A-M-A-R, the letter D, and then J-A-R-R-A-H. Good morning, Ahmed. Always good to be with you on True Talk. Oh, which one is Ahmed? Ahmed?
It's 7 months into this. Good morning, Summer, and good morning to our listeners. Well, it's not good morning. You keep saying good morning, even though
because we've been doing the show
time to now noon, so it's not good morning. It's past noon Eastern time in the United States, on the East Coast in Tampa, where we're broadcasting from. 7 months into the ongoing war on Gaza, which is described by many, including us here, as a genocide. And the red lines of Joe Biden continue to be shifting. This is Joe Biden said that Rafah will be a red line. And if Netanyahu dares to invade Rafah, there'll be a lot of consequences. Well, the invasion has started, and Joe Biden is still making threats, potential threats, which is causing, as we just heard on NPR News, a lot of people upset in Israel, saying that if they have to go it alone, they will have to. They're making it sound like they're under some, fierce military coalition. They're going against a besieged population of 2.3 million people that have been under siege and blockaded for over 15 years with nowhere to go. They're fighting literally women and children that are unarmed. Yes, there is militant groups that are in the area, including Hamas. However, they pale in comparison in their military power compared to Israel. Israel has like one of the fourth strongest military in the world with the most sophisticated weapons, and they're saying, well, if you have to go alone, why do you need to have the United States backing to do all of this? When in reality, they do. That just shows you the amount of ammunition and bombs that they're using there. But that's what we're going to be talking about mostly today. Not necessarily that, but an angle of an article that we saw, Summer, that you actually sent me, written by a Jewish scholar about Zionism. And it's titled, "Don't Be Fooled, Biden is the Real Anti-Semite," which really grabbed my attention. Why did you think that we should have this conversation today, Samar?
I think, Ahmed, because there is so much talk about anti-Semitism, and there is so much about talk about Zionism, and we don't get a chance to talk to a Jewish person to tell us their perspective, what they think of all this that is being said. What do they think of the encampments happening in the colleges? It's important to listen to their voices and see if they beg to differ, because I think President Biden gave a very disturbing speech, in my opinion. For instance, he alluded to the fact that Hamas has ancient kind of hatred when it comes to the Jewish people, and this is really as if he's talking about a Christian.
He didn't say Hamas, but he said, I think he said that the hatred is ancient, meaning, well, Hamas is not ancient, so he must be referring to all the Arabs and all the Muslims in the area.
Anyway, you look. People were wondering if he doesn't know when really Hamas was founded, and also, even if he knew or did not know, what he's saying is really totally wrong. Plus, I think, like, I read it and I listened to it from the perspective of a Muslim and an Arab and a Palestinian, because this is not how we grew up hating Jews, because simply there is an ancient struggle or any of that, or that we grew up hating Jews. We never grew up hating Jews. But my interest was, when I saw this article, was, okay, not all Jews are the same, which we know that, you and I. But I thought it would be interesting to listen to what Mora has to say, because people assume, and the way Biden was talking during the Holocaust memorial, as if all Jews are one kind of people. So maybe she's going to let us know, Mora, that maybe this is correct and maybe this is not correct. So this is the reason I was interested in. Plus, I went to her articles. You know, I have been following so many people online the past few months, especially after the genocide taking place in Gaza. And it is interesting to see perspectives from somebody who is Jewish and see how they think of what is going on there. And especially that, I think, if I'm not mistaken, she went to Palestine and the occupied territories in 2018. So she's somebody who has traveled to that part of the world. I mean, she has a degree in anthropology. And, you know, in anthropology, you study people and you study cultures and all that. But she has the added advantage that she went there and saw with her own eyes whether there could be a two-state solution, there could be one democratic state. So that's why I wanted to talk to Mora, and I hope that she's with us now. I can't hear you, Ahmed.
Yeah, she's going to be joining us shortly. I just want to also just get your reaction. What we're going to also talk to her about is the student encampments, campus, and what's happened there and continues to happen. Are you surprised by how viciously the police and student and university administrators are attacking or cracking down on the student protests?
I don't want to say surprised or not. Maybe what is surprising and shocking, Ahmed, is that if you look at the police, whether they are in Chicago or in New York or in Washington or in Amsterdam or in Paris or in Italy, are they all following the same manual? Is there one manual for these police officers to be roughing up students, unarmed people protesting? I mean, isn't the West always preaching to the Arab world that you have no democracy, you have no freedom of speech, you imprison people who express their views? How come now that there are young Western students expressing their views, you are beating them up, using tear gas and using all this to disperse them? So what is surprising, Ahmed, is as if there is one manual and they're all
following the same manual, even though they're across the country.
Yeah.
Well, are they talking to each other because they're using similar tactics, with the exception of a few schools? Some schools that actually just said, let's talk to the students, and they negotiated with them as things have happened in history. But for some reason, this specific issue, when it comes to Israel, they want to silence the students. And then they're conflating. Students were on the pro-Palestinian, pro-Palestine, anti-genocide. Students were actually the ones that are peaceful, and they were subjected to the violence and being attacked by counter pro-Israel students. Yet all attention and accusations of violence is directed at the Palestinian, pro-Palestine students, which actually included Jewish students as well. But we're now, Mora Finkelstein is actually joining us now on the show. Welcome to the program. And Samar, if you could just introduce her.
Good to have you, Mora, on True Talk. She is an ethnographer, associate professor of anthropology. She's also the author of a book, The Archive of Loss. And she has very interesting articles that she has published and essays that you can go to if you go to morafinkelstein.com. And she has an MA in anthropology from Columbia University and a PhD in anthropology from Stanford Universities. So good to have you, Mora, on True Talk. A few days ago, I saw your piece published, and I don't have it in front of me at the moment. Can you tell us about it? I think what is it called?
Yeah, why don't you tell us why you wrote the piece, and it says why Biden is the real anti-Semite. I was surprised when you think of Biden, he projects himself as this hero for Jewish people, and he's standing up against anti-Semitism. He gave this huge speech on the Holocaust Remembrance Day earlier this week about how we shouldn't forget what happened in the Holocaust. But you came out and as a Jewish person and a scholar and said, well, no, Biden is the real anti-Semite. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, thank you for having me on. It's an honor to be here and to be in conversation with you. Thank you. I really appreciate the work that you all are doing. Over the past 7-8 months and also the past almost 4 years and 8 years, the past 8 years have been exhausting in the United States and around the world. I've been, watching the rhetoric, not just around Palestine, but also around Judaism and anti-Semitism, and following the way in which Biden has talked about Israel across the scope of his career. And what's incredibly concerning to me is that Biden is not talking about Jewish Americans. He's not talking about, Judaism. He's talking about Zionism. And he's very clear about that. He identifies as a Zionist. If you go back through his record, he has always had very staunch Zionist views, which I see as a form of white supremacy. And when he talks about protecting Jews, or when he talks about, how he's in conversation with Jewish Americans, he's not talking about the sort of heterogeneous way in which Americans can be Jewish. He's specifically talking about Jews who identify as Zionists. And I think what's particularly dangerous about this is, and I've written about this elsewhere, as have many, many, many people. This is not my idea at all. But Israel is actually an incredibly anti-Semitic project, and Biden has found it to be incredibly useful. So, for example, aside from the fact that the existence of Israel is absolutely devastating to Palestinians, the existence of Israel is absolutely devastating to global Jews, because what it does is allows countries like the United States, countries in Europe, to say, we don't have to deal with our anti-Semitism problem. There's Israel. You are only safe because Israel exists, which is a really, really, really terrifying way to think about citizenry. And so, when I say that I think that Biden is the real anti-Semite, he is, if we look around what's happening, and I know we'll talk about this in detail, he's actually making Jews more unsafe. The students, and we'll get to this as well, the students at the encampments who are being attacked are anti-Zionist Jews alongside their Palestinian comrades and other anti-Zionists. There are no Zionists who are getting attacked by the police. There are no Zionists who are doing anything other than talking about feelings of unsafety. But when we think about who's actually being attacked, we're seeing that it's anti-Zionist Jews. So when I say that Biden is the real anti-Semite, it's not just his discourse around Israel, but it's also his narrative around who gets to be Jewish in the United States.
So you're drawing a distinction between being Zionist and being Jewish. Are there any reports or studies or surveys about the percentage of Jewish people that are Zionist? Because from what you hear from people like AIPAC and groups like AIPAC and others, that every single Jew in the world is a Zionist, and that's not to be questioned. And if you attack Zionism, that must be anti-Semitism. You're anti-Jewish. You hate the Jewish people. Are there any ideas what the percentage of Zionism is among the Jewish people?
Yeah, that's an important question, and it's a hard one to answer. I would say that I don't have any numbers or percentages offhand. I would imagine that the majority of Jews are Zionists, and the reason that I think that is true is because when you're raised Jewish in America, except for a very small percentage of people, you're not given an option to be anything other than a Zionist. Growing up in the United States in the 80s and 90s, Israel and Judaism was being completely married together. When I would go to my synagogue as a child, there were, Israeli flags hanging on the walls. There were signs that said, "We stand with Israel." When I went to religious school, the teachers who were teaching me Hebrew were former Israeli soldiers who were doing fellowships in the United States. We also see that with Hillel on college campuses. And so it is true, I believe, that the majority of Jews are Zionists or non-Zionists, just because there's not enough critical discourse about the distinction and how to exist otherwise in the world. But at the same time, anti-Zionism is a Jewish construction. And there's a really great book that just came out by Jeffrey Levin called Our Palestine Question that looks at the ways in which anti-Zionist and to some extent non-Zionist Jewish activity over the 20th century was really silenced both by the United States and by Israel. So I think that there's two things operating. One, in which the sort of Hezbollah Israeli propaganda machine is so powerful that Jews are being indoctrinated, American Jews are being indoctrinated to Zionism from a very, very young age. It starts in religious schools, like Sunday schools, and it continues on through the work of Hillel International on college campuses. And I think it's also, so there's that aspect. And then there's also the aspect of Israeli and American work to silence dissent around Israel. So I would say that the majority of Jews are probably Zionists, but when we look at anti-Zionist activities that are happening, across the country right now, a lot of it is being sort of spearheaded or in connection with the work of like Jewish Voices for Peace, which is actively anti-Zionist, and organizations like If Not Now that are not anti-Zionist, but there are anti-Zionists who are part of those projects. And we're seeing that, through wide-ranging protest movements, and we're specifically seeing that on college campuses right now.
Right. What you mentioned, I saw depicted in this film called Israelism, how they indoctrinate, how across the country, young Jewish people from even just being toddlers in daycare, they get indoctrinated in this type of Zionism that is somehow synonymous with being Jewish. What does Zionism mean to you, and why is it a problem?
Yeah. Zionism to me is a settler colonial project that believes that, Jewish settlers claim a right to Palestine, both because of anti-Semitism in Europe more generally and because of the Holocaust. And so, early Zionists at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries were very explicit about the fact that they were colonizing Palestine. That was the language that was being used. So this idea of Zionism being the belief that Jewish people have a right to the land that is Palestine because of some biblical claim is a settler colonial project. And so I think that when in the current moment, we see Zionists say Zionism is just a love for Israel, or, being Jewish means that I care about Israel. That is code for a belief that Jews are somehow entitled to a theocratic ethno-state. Nobody is entitled to a theocratic ethno-state. It's a ridiculous concept, but that there's a lot of investment in that, both through, the way in which anti-Semitism has worked across Europe for centuries, and also specifically because of the Holocaust. So essentially justifying one genocide through another genocide, I believe, is the Zionist project.
So, Maura, can we absolutely separate between Zionism and the religion and the faith of Judaism? So Zionism is a political idea, because this is, I think, where most people try to conflate the two. Like, if I criticize Israel, if I criticize Zionism, you are anti-Semitic. How do you deal with this? Because especially for non-Jews who try to take a stand and say, I'm supporting the Palestinians, or I want to end the occupation. How do you deal with it? How do others have to deal with it? How do we separate that this is really not Judaism, and Judaism is a faith and separate from this political ideology?
Yeah, that's a great, and it's a complicated question. And, this is on my mind because, Raz Siegel is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University, and has, written very critically and necessarily over the past 7 months, and also his career around these questions. And recently, I think 2 or 3 days ago, was on Jadalia, talking about how anti-Semitism kind of means everything and nothing right now. Like, it's a term that just like isn't actually helping us with anything. And so I think that, and I also, want to sort of think through and continue to think through. Mohammed El-Kurd has written in The Nation that, we are like tiptoeing around and trying so hard to make sure that like we're not being anti-Semitic and we're not attacking Jews. But when settlers come into Palestinian villages and murder and raise, Palestinian lives, they're doing it because they are claiming that they are Jewish settlers. So I think the way in which Zionism and Judaism sort of gets conflated, for me, the work of liberation is not about like, paying so much attention to narrative and discourse and trying to make sure that we're using all of the right words, but instead to think about how there's real material reality that we have to think about, which is that, yes, Zionism is a political ideology and Judaism is a religious and ethnic identity. And I think this is really critical in the way that dissent is being silenced in the United States and across Europe right now, in the sense that like being an anti-Zionist means that you can be accused of discrimination because people are claiming Zionism as their sort of ethnic and national identity. And I think that that's very dangerous. But I also think that when we're talking about liberation work and we're talking about how, Jewish settlers in Palestine are carrying out different levels of genocide because they are Jewish and in the name of Judaism, the sort of like disentangling Judaism and Zionism starts to become meaningless. There's a lot of different ways to be Jewish, just like there's a lot of different ways to be Palestinian. There's a lot of different ways to be Muslim, except, there's a lot of different ways to be Christian. I mean, I grew up in a Christian country that's become more and more fundamentalist over my lifetime. And, we can argue over like whether that's really Christian or not. But I think that these identities are being politicized. And so Jewish identity is being politicized, and Zionism as a political ideology is doing that work.
Mora, when did you personally start to differentiate between the two, between being a Jew and this ideology of Zionism that was being shoved into the kids' mouths everywhere?
Yeah. So I have a little bit of an unusual story. I was really lucky. I was not raised in a actively Zionist household, but I did grow up going to religious school, getting bat mitzvahed, going on Sunday mornings to learn Hebrew and learn about religion. And in those spaces, my Jewish community was staunchly Zionist. I didn't know that word. I didn't know that I could have an identity that wasn't entangled with Israel. And I think a lot of the ways in which that is done is that so much of my Jewish education was actually about the Holocaust. It was about reading the Diary of Anne Frank, which is a controversial text because of its accuracy, but reading that story over and over and over until I had no choice but to identify with this girl who was killed in a concentration camp, just seeing images after images after images of emaciated bodies, of dead bodies, of Nazis. I mean, that is a traumatizing way to grow up. And I think most Jews in America who are getting any kind of religious education are actually getting an education about how our identity is entirely about the Holocaust, and therefore Israel exists and we need Israel in order to be safe. And I've always been a pain in the ass. Like, I've always been like, where can I go to a protest? What can I be an activist about? It's sort of like part of my personality. And I was always a little skeptical of this, project that was tying my identity to a country that I had never been to, but I didn't really have any language about that. And then I had this really wonderful experience my senior year of high school where I took it was the 90s. We were all like wrapped up in the conversation of peace talks and post-Oslo, et cetera, et cetera. And I had a history teacher who taught the history of the Middle East as a sort of like interactive peace talks. And so he set up the table around layers of power. And I wish that he was still alive so I could ask him how intentional this was. But there were like 10 students who represented the US, and there were 8 students who represented Israel. And I was the single student who was assigned to represent Palestine. And it was very scary. And it was the early days of the internet. And I was like, it was like 1996. And I was, at my family's like IBM dial-up, trying to learn about the history of Palestine so that I could go into this end of the year assignment and argue on behalf of Palestine. And I'm a teacher now, and I think about Mr. Bedier and how he totally, he gave me the tools I needed for my own liberation. And, that sort of sent me down a road of understanding that if my identity was being tied to Israel without my consent,
anything in
then
particular,
my Jewish...
Sorry, Maura, but anything in particular when you started going to the new internet, anything was the aha moment or the minute you said, oh my gosh, there's something here I need to look more into, was there a book, a site, something, a story? What triggered it?
I'm trying to remember. I mean, I can't remember if I read anything in particular that I can sort of pull out, but I learned about the Nakba. Nobody had ever taught me about the Nakba. And I was like, the Nakba is a genocide. The Nakba, the ongoing Nakba, was done, as a reaction to one genocide in reaction to another. And I think learning that term and understanding the scope of what I had previously understood as an independence, birth of a nation narrative around Israel was actually this incredibly violent genocidal project of erasing Palestinian life from the landscape. It wouldn't be until many, many years later that I realized I was implicated in that, because when I got bat mitzvahed when I was 13, everyone I knew planted a tree in Israel in my name. And as a young environmentalist, I thought that was really wonderful, until later I realized that actually that was a project of, erasing Palestinian villages by planting deciduous trees over that. So, this is an education that lasted a very long time in which I kept learning. But I think, being 17 years old and realizing that I had actually been lied to, and that there was this entirely other history that, was being consistently erased in order to justify the settler colonial project. That was a turning point for me. I
don't know if Ahmed wants to ask, but I wanted to ask you.
I can tell that Maura, even years later, is very emotional about this. In her voice, and why do these memories bring so much emotion to you?
I think that there's so many different reasons. I think that it's the realization that, sometimes you just need one teacher to open a door or show you another way of thinking about the world, and it can be this life-changing thing that continues on. I don't know what my story would have been if Mr. Bedier hadn't assigned me to Palestine, but I think about how right now we're seeing across the country at these student encampments, what we are seeing is our students putting into action the things that we have been teaching them, and the administration is calling in militarized police to shut them down. And I just think about how, education is actually quite dangerous to institutions of power. And I experienced that when I was able to think beyond my own experience, beyond my own imagination. It lost me, friends and family. And now we're seeing students who have had the same experience, where their eyes have been opened to the world. They can't go back. They can't ever be the same. And that is because possibly a teacher showed them something, or in community with each other, they learned something. I think, as a teacher, I think that, institutions are spaces of small-mindedness in the way that they operate, but in the way that we are actually able to learn in all of these ungovernable ways, they can be spaces of, revolution.
Right. Our show is actually broadcasting live on the radio as well as on Twitter. And it's also a podcast for later that people could listen to. So if you're joining us now live, we're actually speaking to Dr. Mara Finkelstein. She is an associate professor with recent work on Palestine and Zionism at Allegra Lab in the Scottish Left Review. And she has a master's from Columbia University and a PhD from Stanford University. Both of those universities had encampments. You saw how the New York Police Department and the administration at Columbia cracked down on the students there. Many of them were assaulted. They were using military type weapons and gear, and they treated them as some sort of terrorists when these encampments were mostly peaceful. And there was so much attention by the media, from the New York Times. All the media was fixated on what's happening in Colombia. Why is there such a, so much attention specifically on Colombia itself, as someone who actually graduated from there, got their master's from there? And you saw that students, Jewish and Muslim, Arab, people of faith, non-faith, and even faculty were all on the side of Palestine. And then you had these agitators and all this effort to try to mischaracterize this encampment and others, that somehow that these are pro-Hamas, they're pro-violence, even going as far as saying that they're calling for the genocide of Jews. And they were doing no such thing. They're actually, what was so mind-boggling is they were speaking out and protesting a current genocide. Meanwhile, the government and the politicians and the media are accusing them of calling for a genocide. How was that flipped around? And just, your commentary on why there was so much attention paid specifically to Colombia and what was happening there.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I was a master's student at Columbia in the anthropology department between 2003 and 2005. And this is actually where I learned the term anti-Zionist, because while I was at Columbia, Professor Joseph Massad, who has constantly been under attack from Zionists, was under attack from Zionists. There's a film that was made by the Israel Project. It was the first time that I got involved with protests. It was the first time that I found a sort of really diverse group, Jewish students, Muslim students, Arab students, Palestinian students, who were together in this fight on behalf of a Palestinian professor who was under attack. And, this is at the institution of Edward Said. This is in New York. It's an urban campus. And Columbia has, we know about the protests of 1968. Columbia is an Ivy League school. It has a lot of attention. It's in New York. And so I think it's sort of at the epicenter of a lot of conversations. But also it has a very long history of students advocating on behalf of Palestinians and Palestine. And it also has a very long history of administrations supporting Zionist students and alumni because of Zionist donors. And so I think, even though the encampments at Stanford happened in the fall, I think they began in November, I think that the attention that Columbia got because of its history, because of its placement, because of, the way in which the congressional hearings positioned Columbia in such a way that Shafiq had an opportunity to, appease the right wing. I think it was sort of perfect storm. But I also think what's really important to understand, and I think Palestine is always an exception in terms of campus discourse, because the United States is such a Zionist country. Zionism is baked into the fabric of the United States, which is also a settler colonial state. The United States does not want, Palestine to be free, because that would mean that we would actually have to grapple with our settler colonial history. But I also think, we like to think about these institutions of higher learning as schools, but they're actually banks and landowners before they're anything else. They're about investments. They're about making money. They're about claiming land. Columbia has claimed so much of Harlem. Columbia has, its finances entangled in so many different places. And so if education can also happen there, that's fine. But anything that threatens the financial and sort of structural integrity of an institution that's all about extraction will be shut down. And I think we're seeing that across the country. These schools are revealing themselves to not actually be institutions of higher learning. They are banks that offer classes.
Mora, the $1 million question that I keep asked from the Arab world is that how did these students in elite schools who were being prepped and prepared to become this next generation that will take over all these jobs that the elites have, how did they escape the Zionist propaganda? How did they escape all this machinery of turning them into the next elites? Like, what happened? Is it social media, really? Is it interacting with the clubs in the colleges, like you mentioned, Jews for Peace, I think, and Peace Now, and I know there is Students for Justice for Palestine and other groups. Is it the professor? Is it all of that? Like what? What is it? How did they escape the grip of this capitalist brainwashing that happens to young people from a young age?
That's such an important question, and I think, I can only answer it in the way that I've seen it play out. So, this is not a universal answer, but I think a big part of this is social media. And I think that a big part of this is the fact that Palestinians are live streaming their own annihilation. We are all in the United States, everyone I'm in conversation with, we are following Palestinians on the ground in Gaza, in the West Bank, who are showing us exactly what is happening to them. And we are sort of learning from people who are showing us exactly what has been done to them for 75 years. And these are very well educated, very, media savvy young people, for the most part, who are speaking directly to young people in the United States, and young people in the United States are hearing them. I mean, I think this is, one of the things that I think about a lot is that Palestinians have been teaching Americans what solidarity looks like for years now. We can look at Standing Rock and Palestinians in Palestine sending their support to the encampment at Standing Rock. We can look at the Black Lives Matter movement and the alliance between Black Americans and Palestinians in Palestine. Palestinians have been showing us what solidarity looks like. And a lot of young people in America have been listening. They've been learning, and they are, waking up, and they are getting onto Instagram, and they are making sure that Bassam is still alive. They are looking at the images that are coming out of Rafah. They are looking at the numbers, right now, what is the official number? 34,000. I mean, that must be 10,000 at least under the amount of people who have been killed. We are seeing the bodies of babies who have been, blown up. We're seeing this every single day. And I think the only people who believe that there's not a genocide happening are the people who are listening to our political leaders, who are listening to the people who are in charge of our institutions, and who are paying attention to corporate media as though it is telling the truth. But if we, are actually doing the work of listening to Palestinians, there's absolutely no way that these encampments wouldn't be happening. I think that the United States has been doing work in partnership with Israel for decades now to convince Americans that Palestinians cannot be trusted, that they are all inherently terrorists, that they are all inherently Hamas. I mean, Biden can't even say the word Palestinian. He never does it, right? He's only ever talking about Hamas. But when we are thinking about the fact that young people understand that they can only trust Palestinians to tell their own stories, that Palestinians are the experts in their own lives, and that they are literally showing us what our tax dollars are doing. Every single taxpayer in the United States is funding Israel's genocide in Palestine, and young people are pissed off. They're outraged, and they are showing that through the encampments, which are being demonized by the media. I mean, if you listen to corporate media in the United States, you would think that it's all outside agitators and people breaking windows. And personally, I think that more windows could be broken. But, if you're actually going to the encampments, they're spaces of solidarity. They're beautiful. They're intergenerational. They're spaces of learning. There's community care. I mean, there's nothing more beautiful right now in the United States than what is happening at these student encampments, and what an absolute threat to power, which is why we're seeing them so violently shut down.
They are threatening. It seems like a big threat because they're dedicating so much resources to shut them down
Millions.
in very violent ways and to mischaracterize them as some sort of encampments of hate. You saw Senator Cotton say that these are little Gazas, as that these are somehow terrorist bastions that are all over the country, and it's just unbelievable that so many in the media don't challenge these narratives, especially they have reporters on the ground that see the opposite, but yet they choose to go and find the outliers, the agitators. There are reports of people who are actually pro-Israeli that go in dressed with keffiyehs, pretending to be Arab, pretending to be Palestinians, and then shout anti-Semitic stuff. And then the media just focuses on them, and they're far away from the encampments. Dr. Mara, in your article in Mondoweiss that we saw that said, titled, "Don't Be Fooled, Biden is the Real Anti-Semite," and you identify yourself. I am an anti-Zionist Jew. This is the core of my Jewish identity. And basically, based on our conversation, you're saying more and more are speaking out against that. Growing up, when you're going back to this indoctrination that you were talking about, that a lot of Jewish Americans from a young age are undergoing, you mentioned how they're using or misusing the Holocaust to indoctrinate young people. I mean, I remember growing high school, and every year we would have an assembly. The whole school would be there. And we didn't have that many Jewish people in our school, but we'd have a whole assembly about the Holocaust, and they would give a presentation, and we'd see images and films. And it was almost like mandatory, even though that happened so far away from here. But I wanted to, and there's never any mention about the Palestinians. Growing up, what were you taught about the Palestinians and what Palestine, was the word ever mentioned? Obviously, you said you never heard about the Nakba, but what did you hear about Palestine, Muslims, Arabs, and what is the, I guess, perception for young Jewish people and what they're teaching them in these day schools?
And maybe Mora, to complement Ahmed's question, so how did this nation come to being? Like there was an empty land and they just...
Yeah, how did Israel, has it always been there? And where did it come from? I mean, is that part like that, I guess, chronology, was it taught how it became what it is? So yeah, if you can just share with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, so, I can speak to my own Jewish education, and, it is within, I think, Jewish education, it was sort of moderate. So there's much more extreme on different ends of what a Jewish education can look like. But, this question of a land without a people for a people without a land, there was very much this idea that, Palestine, which was never the term used, it's always Israel. Palestine was this desert with like a few goat herders who were like on the fringes. I mean, to the point in which like maybe, Palestinians were never talked about until they were talked about as, terrorists who hate our freedom, terrorists who hate democracy. We made the desert grow. Now they want it. They'll kill you just for being Jewish. The sort of like inherent racist, orientalist, Islamophobic narrative of all Palestinians as these sort of terrorists waiting in the bushes to kill Jews was circulated as a sort of, mythology, urban legend. Nobody knew any Palestinians in, the community that I was growing up, at least, not overtly. There was never any sort of talk of actual people. It was just this like shadowy specter, this danger that lurked. And I think, Jews in America have been perfectly primed for this because we, learned the same thing about Germans during World War II, right? That like, we have always been a people. It's this victimization narrative. We've always been a people that everyone wants to kill, whether it's because, Jews believe that, we're God's chosen people or, because of other economic justifications, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that if you grow up being told you were a victim, you are a victim, you will always be a victim, that is trauma, right? That is like a community that cannot actually grapple with their own trauma. And so it's passed down generation to generation. And there always has to be someone to blame. So if Zionists, Jewish Zionists in America were ever to actually deal with their trauma, they would, go from having an enemy that they were taught to hate in order to keep their trauma locked down to actually grappling with the fact that so many people have been living through historical trauma for so long, and that doesn't become an excuse to move from being the victims of genocide to the perpetrators of genocide. And I'm not a psychologist, but you see that in abuser cycles of abuse narratives all the time, and I think that's the story that a lot of Jews are taught in the United States. This is what happened to us in World War II and the Holocaust. Never again, never again, never again. Never again means you have to protect yourself from always being the victim because of this exceptional circumstance. I think the other problem with a Jewish education in the United States is that most Jews are taught that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. They're not taught that 12 million people were killed in the Holocaust. We aren't shown solidarity. We aren't shown the ways in which so many different people can become the victims of state violence. And, I think that that's also a very dangerous narrative that, I have never received as much hate as when I published something called Never Again Means Never Again for Anyone. The amount of Jews who came at me and said, that's not what it means never again for us, is actually like the saddest thing that I have ever seen, in which Jewish Zionists say, how dare you co-opt the Holocaust? The Holocaust is ours. It's our story. And when we say never again, we mean never again for us.
I mean, and only us, only Jewish
Only
people.
us. Yeah.
So it's okay for others. So is that by that narrative, it's okay for others, but not for us, for the Jewish people?
Yeah. Yeah. Or nobody else could ever experience a genocide like we did. So, we are exceptional. And what never again means is let's make sure that the Jews never experience another genocide, which I think allows for, whether it be, Israeli politicians or American Jews, to refer to October 7th as a genocide, or as a genocide against Jewish people, the largest, mass killing of Jews since the Holocaust, which is beyond not only incorrect, but it's incredibly dangerous. And it's also kind of Holocaust denial. But this narrative of we are exceptional and we are the only ones.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you more about that, about Jewish identity. On one hand, they're taught, you're saying this indoctrination of victimhood and everybody's out against us and look what happened. What about, is there a concept of, in Zionism, of exceptionalism, that a type of being superior to others in a similar, because I see a lot of kind of overlap between the type of Zionism we're seeing on display in Israel right now and white supremacy. Is there a correlation? And even on college campuses, we saw what happened, this viral video from University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, where a black woman who was protesting for Palestine was filming, and all these white boys that were attacking her, and one of them is mimicking monkey gestures and sounds as if, calling her a monkey and, go away monkey. This is to a black woman on a college campus in the United States in 2024. And this is the pro-Israel side. This is the side that's supporting the Israelis. So is there an overlap? Is there a type of supremacy ideology within Zionism that is also somehow connected with white supremacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that they're cut from the same cloth. And, if we think about whiteness in the United States, and I think we always have to be very specific about where we're talking about race and power. So within the history of the United States, whiteness expands and contrasts in order to shore up power. So, there are times that Jews and Arabs are considered white. There are times in which Jews and Arabs are considered other, but not necessarily not white. I mean, these categories, we create them. They're real, but we create them. And I think in a country like the United States, where white supremacy reigns supreme, you see something like Zionism as in partnership with white supremacy. It is also a settler colonial project. It is also a project of racism. It is also a project of dehumanization. And so Zionists are very useful for white supremacist projects. We also know that in the United States, the majority of Zionists are Christian Zionists who hate Muslims and Jews. And, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but there's a huge project within Christian Zionists to, amplify and sort of build up the, completely ahistorical conflict between Muslims and Jews in order to completely kill each other out so that the, second coming can happen or whatnot. I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that there's the way in which white supremacists who are also, Christian Zionists see the project, Zionist project in Palestine as incredibly useful for their own means. And so, they talk about this ancient grudge between, Jews and Muslims, which is completely ahistorical and not true at all. It's actually so counterintuitive. We have far more in common than not. When I was in Palestine, I was constantly being asked if I was Palestinian. It was the greatest honor of my life. But, when you take away people's passports and I don't open my mouth because I don't speak Arabic, we look like we can all be family, and we should be. And yet we're seeing the project of white supremacy, coming in between and creating this very new conflict that is entirely political and not at all, religious at all. But I guess I would, to sort of try to answer that question, Zionism in Palestine is a white supremacist project. Zionism in the United States is a white supremacist project. And, in a settler colonial state, that is the sort of that foundation, the foundation of racism, the foundation of a structure of apartheid. So they go hand in hand. And Jews, when Jews are no longer useful to this project, they'll be cast outside of whiteness again.
Let me remind our listeners they're listening to True Talk on WMNF 88.5 FM. My co-host Ahmed and myself, Samar, are talking to Maura Finkelstein, who is an anthropologist and a tenured professor. And those of you who cannot see Maura when she said she was in Palestine, and she would think she's a Palestinian because she has dark hair, maybe darker than mine, and her eyebrows and her lashes and her eyes. She looks exactly as my cousin Abir, who was born actually in Saudi Arabia.
And then she's wearing a keffiyeh.
And I'm not wearing except a little tiny Palestinian flag. But Maura,
I have a little bracelet with the watermelon.
Oh, that's nice. We have 3 minutes more, but I don't know if you want to talk about that or not, but you're a tenured professor, but this activism and all these essays that you have been writing caused you trouble academically? We have 2 minutes.
Yeah. I can't talk about any of the details of this, but many faculty across the United States who speak out on behalf of Palestinians and Palestinian liberation and against Israel's genocide in Gaza and, across occupied Palestine. I'm under investigation. I've been placed on administrative leave. I'm not allowed in the classroom because, talking to our students is incredibly dangerous. And, I will say that, I am tenured and I am Jewish. And I think that in some ways has gotten me a lot of attention. But what we are actually seeing across colleges and universities in the United States is that most of the radical activism is coming from contingent faculty. So people who do not have the protection of tenure, people who are adjuncts, who are visiting, who are lecturers. That's often where the most radical activism and radical scholarship is happening. And it's definitely the space in which people are both the most vulnerable and also the most willing to take risks because they are not, and I was an adjunct and I was I had a visiting position before I was on the tenure track. So, I can only speak from my own experience, but when you see the ways in which institutions do not reward you or the way in which, institutions are, hierarchical spaces of power that you've been cast out of, there's an inclination to be a little bit louder. So, across the United States, tons and tons and tons of contingent faculty have lost their contracts. They've been removed from the classroom. They don't have the protection of tenure. They don't have the protection of being on the tenure track. And so I think that undergraduates, graduate students, lecturers, adjuncts, and visiting faculty are taking an incredible risk in order to live with themselves, because how can you live with yourself if you're not speaking out against genocide? It should be the baseline. I mean, I don't want to use the word humanity because I think it's weighed down by all kinds of colonial imaginations of who gets to be human. But, I know that I could not live with myself if I wasn't as loud as I possibly could be.
Thank you.
Speaking out against genocide.
Thank you, Maura. We have this idea that we have to run out of time. So I want to really thank Maura Finkelstein, an anthropologist and a 10-year professor, for being on True Talk. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Maura. Thank you for your courage, and stay safe.
Okay,
Thank you as well. I'm sending good thoughts.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. WMNF Tampa. NPR, The Scoop is next.
NPR is next.